All rise.
All right, please be seated. Before we continue, let me log on. There was a couple of things I wanted to go over before we brought the jury back out. First, I wanted to clarify a ruling I made because it would potentially change later. I'm not saying it will or it won't, but I want to make sure both sides are clear on this. So earlier, when Miss Jessica Smith was on the stand, defense wanted to offer a statement that had been made by Miss Brophy to Miss Smith about the purchase of a gun build kit at some earlier point in time, and I think why she purchased the kit. Now, I ruled it was hearsay, and I didn't really address the defense argument, which indicated that, well, even if it is hearsay, there's an exception to it under 8033, which allows an exception for statements of a declarant's then existing state of mind, emotion, sensation, or physical condition, such as intent, plan, motive, design, mental feeling, pain, or bodily health, but not including a statement of memory or belief to prove the fact remembered or believed, unless it relates to conditions that don't exist here, having to do with a will. Now, my understanding, and defense can correct me if I'm wrong, is that defense plans to call Ms. Smith later in their case. And if so, I'm certainly open to hear further argument before she testifies as to how defense believes this would fit within the 8033 exception. When I look at the language not including a statement of memory or belief, as I currently understand what the testimony would be, I think that this would be a statement of memory. In other words, it's a statement about something that had happened in the past prior to the conversation with Miss Brophy, and it's a statement about what the motivation was in the past prior to the conversation with Miss Brophy. So I don't know how this fits into that exception, but I'm certainly open to further argument on that exception. Doesn't need to be today, but I just wanted to highlight that for both sides. I guess I will ask defense if I have fairly summarized what defense expected the testimony would have been.
Well, I think the court has, although I would add that Ms. Smith's testimony would be kind of an ongoing plan. So whether the plan was initiated at the time of the purchase and whether there was an ongoing plan to write the book and put the gun kit together over time as she wrote the book, I think it's a continuing plan and one that would have been in place from the time of the purchase all the way up until the time that the state claims that our client murdered Mr. Brophy.
Okay.
So I think it's a little bit of a moving target in terms of what her plan or motive is, but it rebuts in a very fundamental way the state's theory regarding motive and plan.
All right. And I will, you know, as I understand it, we may well have a gap in time between the end of the state's case. I think we're still thinking this in the beginning of the defense case. And it may be helpful during that gap, if the sides can do it, to have some briefing on this exception and how the sides think that the statement either does or does not meet the exception, possibly even having a day where we take up that issue. I just wanted to alert both sides that I am open to further argument on this point, and I do think it is a exception, which is an interesting one, and that's all I'll say. And then I also wanted to let the sides know that on the motion to compel disclosure of defendant statements, I actually did not get a chance to read this over the lunch hour, unfortunately. My understanding is that the sides want to take this up before Nathaniel Stillwater testifies, and I don't know if he's the next witness.
He is not the next witness, Your Honor.
Okay, I guess what I'm trying to figure out just timing wise is whether or not it makes sense to continue with some of the state's witnesses and then I read this during the afternoon break, or do you think we're going to very quickly get to this witness?
I do not think we'll get to him relatively quickly. We would actually plan to take him last today.
Oh, okay,
So I think that it'll certainly be after the break, so that,
okay,
I think that'll
all
work
right.
just fine.
And just a reminder, the sides, what I'll ask defense this question since the jury isn't here. Does it make much difference to defense if we end at 4:45 versus 4:50? Is either time sufficient or is 4:45 better?
It's less of a problem today, Judge, because we're not going to be in session tomorrow.
Oh, I see.
There are two issues. One is getting clothes downstairs.
Okay.
And the other is that on the 7th floor, the space that we've been allowed also has a hard close time of 5 p.m. On the days we forget the car keys down there, that's a problem.
Oh, okay, okay.
But we're getting better about that.
So today we could go to 5 and it wouldn't be a big deal?
Right,
Okay,
right.
fair enough. Then why don't we bring in the jury and we'll just plan to go to 5 today and I'll read this during the break.
Okay, would you like me to leave the record running, Judge?
No, we can turn it off.
Okay, we'll go off record and I'll mute for WebEx.
And the state can call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Rahinder Singh to the stand.
Did you say the last name was Singh?
Singh.
Okay. All right, if we can have you come up and we'll have you step into the witness box, but stay standing for just a moment while my clerk gives you an oath. You can just stand sort of by the chair there, perfect. And then if you can raise your right hand.
Under the penalty of perjury, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Okay, you may be seated, and you can remove your mask. You can take your mask off. And then because we're being recorded, I'm going to ask you to please state and spell your first and last name.
My first name is Rahinder Singh, and my last name is Singh. I mean, first name is Rahinder, my last name is Singh. Sorry.
And how do you spell that?
It's like Robert, A, J, E like Edward, N, Nancy, D, A, R.
All right.
S-I-N-G-H.
Okay. And there is water there if you want any. It's up to you in the pitcher there if you want water.
Oh,
And then the state can inquire when ready.
And good afternoon, Mr. Singh. Without giving us your address, did you used to be neighbors or live close to the Brophies?
pardon me?
Did you used to be neighbors with or live close to the Brophies?
Yes, neighbors.
And
Yes, across the street.
okay, so you're across the street?
Yes.
All right. And did you know Dan and Nancy Brophy?
Yeah, we were neighbors, so we just high and by most of the time.
Not
Not, yeah, I knew he was a teacher in the school, and that's about all.
You
And
didn't
not
ha-
just-
didn't have extensive conversations with them.
Yeah, once in a while we'll talk about stuff, but, you know, at the mailbox whenever we meet, and we'll talk about stuff, I was in a restaurant business back in days, so we do talk about a couple of times.
And did you ever have conversations with Nancy Brophy specifically?
No, not very much.
Prior to Dan Brophy's death, did Nancy Brophy ever talk to you about selling their house?
No, nobody's told me about that.
And do you recall where you were the morning of June 2nd of 2018, the morning that Dan Brophy passed away?
No, I was at the coast, and my neighbor called me up and told me that he passed away.
All right, so you were not home that
I-
morning?
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I was just checking out of the hotel when I had a call from my neighbor. He said the Dan passed away. That's it all. Yeah.
All right. And just a second here. All right. And once you learned of Mr. Brophy's death, did you have any contact with Mrs. Brophy?
Mrs.
With
No,
Nancy Brophy?
No.
Did you go to see her or go talk to her?
Oh, the dead passed. Yeah, we when we got back from the coast, I did. Me and my wife stopped by the house. Nobody was there to say hi to her and, give our sympathy and see what happened.
Did you go back another day?
Yes, I
And-
stopped by another day
Okay.
to go see her, and when I met her there, I gave her a hug, and that's when we talked for a little bit. I told her I was sorry about what happened, and whatever we can do. And in between that conversation, then she, she said about selling the house and moving on. That's when I said, give me opportunity if you are gonna sell the house. So
So she told you she wanted to sell the house and you asked her to give you an opportunity?
Yes,
What for?
see, to buy it. So, to
Say-
buy it.
Oh, to buy it, okay. And so did you and Nancy Brophy at that time have a conversation about what that would look like?
Pardon me?
At that point, did she just say, I'm interested in selling the house, and you said, give me an opportunity to
Yes.
buy? And was that the end of the conversation?
No, we, and then told her that we can go home to my place and to talk to my wife about that too. And she had something to do, so she then stopped by the house and we did talked in my kitchen on the table.
Let me pause you for just a minute, Mr. Herman. Mr. Singh, do you mind bending the microphone just a little? Can you bend the microphone a little closer to you or maybe
Oh.
sit closer to it?
Is
Thank
it
you.
okay?
It's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay.
All right, so Nancy Brophy came over to your house then to talk further with you about selling her house?
Yes.
And what did the two of you talk about?
They bought the house.
Yes.
Yeah, how much was the price, and all those stuff. And then we tell we're gonna get back to her.
And
about
so
that.
did you discuss a price?
Well, we did a little bit, yeah. But she gave me a price, and we thought, okay, we'll talk about that later.
And what was the price? What did you
Uh,
discuss?
Didn't recall. She said it was gonna be if you gonna give me so like it was 4.25 or something. She won't gonna, you know, she's not gonna take that offer. It's gonna be above that. So I thought, okay, we can talk about that later.
Okay, so did
Yeah.
you suggest is that 425,000? Is that
Right.
Did you suggest that number?
No, it didn't.
So she told you
Yeah,
that,
if it's that much, then she won't gonna take that offer.
okay. And did she tell you what sort of offer she was looking for?
Well, I thought it was gonna be more than that, so I didn't say anything. I said, okay, we'll talk about that later. And then she invited us to go and check the house, so we did.
You went over and walked through the house?
Yes.
Okay. And when was this? Do you remember how soon after Mr. Brophy's death?
I think about a week later, yeah.
And so did you go over and look at the house?
Yes.
And in looking at the house, did that affect or change your position on whether you're interested in buying it?
Yeah, I wasn't that much interested because there was a lot to do, so I thought, okay, we'll just pass on it probably.
And so after looking at the house, did you tell Nancy Brophy that you weren't going to buy the house, or how did you leave it?
I didn't, actually, she met my wife in the bank, and my wife did talk to her about that. She said she thinks she will pass on that
Okay, so your wife said she would pass it on.
in the bank.
Okay. And did you ever talk to Nancy Brophy again about the purchase of the house or anything like that?
No.
And Mr. Singh, I'm going to hand you, well, let me ask you this. Do you recall testifying previously about this case?
I talked to you guys, right, DA?
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm going to hand you in just a second a few. Oh, yeah. A few documents. And if you can just read through those to yourself, not out loud, for a second.
That's it.
Okay. And in reading that prior.
One sec. There's more in here. Oh, what was that?
Okay, in reading that prior testimony, does it refresh your recollection and specifically about if you talked to Nancy Brophy about selling the house before Dan Brophy's death?
No, never. Before Dan was alive?
When Dan was alive, yeah.
No.
Oh, okay, reading that doesn't refresh your memory?
No.
Okay. All right, and I just want to clarify something that you said earlier. You were talking about the price when you and Mrs. Brophy were discussing that, and that she had mentioned that 425 would be too low.
Right.
Yeah, can you clarify for me, did you discuss a higher price or were you just,
No.
okay,
I didn't say anything about the price after that. We'll just said we'll talk about that later.
okay,
Once looking inside the house, I knew that there was gonna be too much work for us to do, and so I thought no.
okay. And so would you have been interested in buying the house if it was closer in price to 425? Or you were not interested at all?
Well, yeah, if it was closer to what we think, then I would have done something. Yeah, but it was not even in closer than that, so I would said no. Because
Okay, and what was the reason you were thinking of buying the house?
the reason to buy the I got 2 kids, and I thought if they can, I can get a house for them to live next to me, that would be good, And I said if it's a good price, they can share it and pay the rent. So that was the reason.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, that's all the questions I have.
Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Singh, you know Mrs. Brophy?
Pardon me?
You know Mrs. Brophy?
Right.
So do you recall having a conversation with her in the fall of 2017 and asking her to give you a right of first refusal on the house?
2017?
Yes.
No.
You don't recall asking her?
No, I didn't.
We
She
can't, the court reporter won't like it if we talk at the same time. So I'm gonna let you finish and then I ask a question, but we can't talk at the same time, okay? So in the fall of 2017, specifically, I'm asking whether you recall asking her to give you a right of first refusal.
No.
You don't? Okay,
That's
all right.
cool.
I don't have further questions, Your Honor.
Can you redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Can Mr. Singh be excused?
Yes.
For defense, can Mr. Singh be excused?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Singh, you can step down.
Okay.
And the state will call Arun Singh.
Okay. All right, Ms. Singh, we'll have you come up into this boxed off area, and if you can step into that and just stay standing by the chair, my clerk will give you an oath.
Okay, I'll have you raise your right hand. Under the penalty of perjury, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Okay, then you may be seated. Okay, and you can go ahead and take off your mask. And then because we're being recorded, I'll just ask you to please state and spell your first and last name.
Arun, Arun, Singh, Singh.
All right, and Ms. Singh, there's water there if you want any in the pitcher, but whenever the state's ready, they can inquire.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Singh.
Good afternoon.
Without giving us your address, were you previously neighbors with the Brophy family?
Yes,
And it sounds like you lived across the street, is that right?
yes,
Like directly across or
kitty corner.
kitty corner? All right. And how long had you lived at that home?
Since 2000,
Okay. And so when you moved in, were the Brophies already living at that house?
yes.
Over the course of that next 18 years or so, did you get to know the Brophies at all?
No,
Did you ever talk to either of them?
no,
Not in passing or at the mailbox, really?
no.
And so did you know them by name at all or just by sight?
Name very recently. By sight, not much.
All right. And do you recall back in June, on June 2nd of 2018, did you learn that day about Mr. Brophy's death?
It wasn't that day, no.
What day was it?
A few days later,
And were you home at the time?
no,
Were you out of town?
yes.
And it sounds like perhaps someone called you and let you know.
Neighbors let me know.
When you got back in town, was it, it sounds like a couple days after his death? Is that right?
Yes,
Did you make contact with Mrs. Brophy or go talk to her?
a few days after that even.
And so what did you do?
Me and my daughter walked over to the house.
And did you have a conversation with Mrs. Brophy? Did you go inside?
We did, and yes, we did have a conversation.
And what did she talk to you about?
Not to remember exactly, but we were there to sympathize and don't remember much more, but we did have a little bit of conversation and we were sorry about the situation and
And do you recall if she talked to you at all about what had happened to her husband?
no, we were not comfortable asking too much detail. So
And she didn't talk to you at all about where it had happened or anything like that?
don't remember exactly.
After going over to sort of pay your condolences or check in, did you talk to Mrs. Brophy on another occasion?
Later, yes.
And how much later do you remember?
No, approximately 2 weeks later, maybe.
And where did you have that conversation?
Mrs. Brophy walked over to our house.
And did she come into your house?
Yes,
And what did you talk to her about at that time?
she wanted to know if we would buy her house.
And so were you present during that conversation with, and your husband was also present?
I was the only one present at first.
Okay. And so what did Mrs. Brophy tell you during that conversation?
That she was selling her house and if we were interested to buy it.
And did she give you a price or did the two of you talk about that?
4 1/4 she offered, no less.
All right. And at that point, what did you do?
I told her I would think about it.
And did she leave? Did you have further conversation?
We did talk for a little bit. It was really hot, so we sat down in the kitchen and offered ice cream and talked for a little bit.
And did she talk to you all at that time about what had happened to her husband or anything about the incident?
At that time, no.
Was there another time then that she came back to talk about the house, or that you had another conversation with her?
Later at the credit union, she stopped by and I had said, no, I can't buy the house.
And so, during the conversation that your husband had with Mrs. Brophy about buying the house, were you present for that conversation?
In that same conversation that day, he came in later on.
Okay, so when she comes over and the two of you are talking, he joined you at some point.
Yes.
Okay. And do you remember if she talked to you at all about, you said, I think 4.25 was a price that was mentioned. Did you talk at all about higher prices or the value of the home?
Not at all. I wasn't sure I would buy the house, so no.
Okay, would it be fair to say that you weren't particularly interested yourself in buying the house?
Correct.
And after that discussion at some point, did you go with your husband to go look at the house?
Yes.
Was that the same day?
No.
Different day?
Different day.
Okay. And had you made a decision about buying the house at that point or no?
I wasn't I wasn't able to buy it.
All right. And did your mind change at all after walking through the house?
Oh, no.
And at some point, do you remember if you discussed either with Mrs. Brophy or in some capacity how much the house was worth?
No, but I need to pull the value online.
Okay, and so you looked it up yourself.
Yeah.
And did that help inform your decision on whether or not you were going to buy it?
It didn't change my decision. I never intended to buy it.
And Mrs. Singh, do you recall looking it up and seeing how much you thought the house was worth?
From I remember,
Actually-
over 600.
Your Honor, I think this calls for hearsay. She's asking her to relate something that she read on the internet.
So the question so far has just been if she looked it up. There hasn't been a question as to what the value was. If the next question is going to be what the value was, then I would sustain a hearsay objection.
And I think she's trying to answer with the value in the answer
Oh,
to
I
that
see.
question.
All right. So what is the question the state wants to ask? And don't answer right now, Ms. Singh. I just want to make sure I understand the question.
My question, Your Honor, is if she previously, in a previous interview, told officers, is where I'm going with this, how much she believed the house was worth.
So are you you're trying to ask what she thought the value of the house was?
Yes.
And that's, yeah, I'm going to sustain the objection. If her basis of knowledge is from reading it online, I'm sustaining the objection.
And Mrs. Singh, at some point, either during the conversations you've mentioned or in another conversation, did you talk to Mrs. Brophy specifically about the Oregon Culinary Institute and the circumstances or details around the death of Dan Brophy?
Circumstances around the death? No, I don't remember.
Do you remember talking to detectives back in January of 2019?
Do I remember talking to them in January around 2019? No, sorry.
Do you remember being interviewed by police at some point?
Yes.
Do you remember talking to police at all about conversations related that you had with Mrs. Brophy related to the Oregon Culinary Institute and details about how the building was set up or what was or was not present?
No, I don't recall. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm going to hand you what is date stamped as discovery page 2598. So if you could just read from the top of that page down a couple paragraphs to yourself.
So she said, yeah, there are a couple of doors,
Oh,
you
just
know.
a second. Just
Yourself, not out loud, okay?
Okay, sorry.
all right. And in reading that, does that refresh your memory?
A little bit.
Okay. And so do you recall having a conversation with Mrs. Brophy about the Oregon Culinary Institute or details about it?
Yes, I think this is when we went to visit the first time, me and my daughter. And I don't know if it was me or my daughter that had mentioned um, what the situation was or wasn't there. The situation about, I don't know how we exactly phrased it. I think my daughter had said something about wasn't there a camera or something that would have caught this situation, and how did somebody get in?
And what did Mrs. Brophy tell you?
I wish I could recall the exact words. I don't remember. But this seems about right.
And so what does, if you reading that to yourself, does it refresh your memory enough to recall what she told you?
Yes.
And what was that?
That the entrance, again, the exact words here, that there were one door for the students, and that not many people knew about that one.
Okay. And all right. And do you remember if Mrs. Brophy's mentioned anything to you about cameras?
I don't know the exact, but I remember we mentioning it, but or my daughter, but I don't remember what the answer was.
All right, thank you. That's all the questions I have.
All right, any cross-examination?
No questions, Your Honor. Thank you, Ms. Singh.
May Ms. Singh be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Singh, you can step down. Thank you.
I'm sorry, what was it?
Who is the state's next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The state's going to call Andrew Bresciani.
Okay. All right, Mr. Bresciani, you can come up here to the witness box, and we'll have you step into it and stand by that chair, but don't have a seat just yet. My clerk will give you an oath.
Okay, I'll have you step a little closer to the microphone. Thank you. And then please raise your right hand. Under the penalty of perjury, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, then you may be seated. And you can take off your mask. And then, because we're being recorded, I'll ask you to please state and spell your first and last name.
My name's Andrew Bresciani, spelled Andrew. Last name B as in boy, Resciani.
All right, and there is a pitcher of water there if you want it.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. And then after he's got his water, the state can inquire.
Okay, Mr. Bresciani, I really just have a few questions for you. I'll be fairly brief here. Where are you currently employed?
Redefine moving?
Redefine Moving?
Yes.
And were you working at Redefine Moving in 2018?
I was not, no.
Where were you working in 2018?
All my sons moving in storage.
Same line of work, just a different company. And in 2018, were you contacted by somebody named Nancy Brophy?
Yes.
Was this a visit in person to your place of work, or was this a phone call?
It was a phone call.
And did she call you, or were you calling her for some reason?
She called me.
Do you remember about what time of year this was?
I want to say maybe the summer. I don't really recall what time of year. I felt like the summer.
Okay. And when she called you, you said you spoke directly with her, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And what was the nature of her phone call to you?
At that time, from the best of my recollection, she wanted to get a quote to move from Portland, and I feel like it was maybe Nevada or Arizona, somewhere in that region.
Okay. And so she was calling you to get a quote for your moving services.
Yes.
And that is part of one of the services, not just actually driving a truck to one place or another, but you actually help like load the truck.
Yeah, transporting household goods.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so was that what she was calling you for?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so she was asking you for a quote for assistance, or I'm sorry, for the service of transporting her household goods to either Nevada or Arizona. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's correct.
And were you able to provide her a quote for that?
I'll be honest, I can't recall that portion as far as pricing. I think back then I would have referred her to get an in-home estimate, since the amount of that cost would have been greater than a local move. And it was usually our protocol back then.
Not as maybe different during the pandemic, things changed, but not as easy just to throw out a quote over the phone.
And that's correct, yeah. There's a lot of factors.
Sure, you need to see how much stuff and all that.
Yeah, cubic feet, and yeah.
Okay. And I know we're asking you to recall a phone call from about 3.5 years ago.
Yeah.
Was there anything else about that phone call as to what stood out to you, or what's causing you to remember it today?
Yeah, to the best of my recollection, things that stood out that were unusual about the phone call. I believe she had stated that she was a widow, or recently. And then, we were talking, and I can't really remember about the pricing because that was just something I did every day, But what stood out to me is she said, she asked me, what's your policy? I feel like that's what she said. What's your policy on divulging information or giving out personal information if somebody was looking for me? That's what I feel like. And I just thought it was odd. I do recall that
Your Honor, we have a matter for the court.
He's answering the question.
All right, let's have the jury step out for a minute.
Okay. All rise for the jury.
All right, we're still on the record.
Your Honor, we have previously expressed concern and have a motion that we've agreed to hear at the break today, this afternoon, about the fact that statements of the defendant have not been disclosed to us. I think the state's position is that they're not memorialized. they don't need to disclose them, but I want the court to be aware that the statement that has been disclosed to us from this witness is very, very short. Simply says that he was interviewed on September 6th at about 14:50 hours. He was called by a detective. The detective explained to him that an All My Sons receipt was found during service of the search warrant on September 5th at the Brophy residence. Mr. Bresciani told me Nancy Brophy at cell phone 5, and I won't read her phone number into the record, but her cell phone, had called and placed a $200 security deposit with an actual move date of August 27th, 2018 and August 29th, 2018 to load 2 pods, one 16-foot and one 12-foot. Mr. Bresciani told me that on August 29th, Nancy Brophy called him, said she was moving out of state to Arizona or Nevada. This is the report on September 6th of 2018. It bears no resemblance to what he's saying now. That has not been disclosed to us. And we think that the statute requires that we be given notice. This is clearly something that we would want to know about ahead of time. He's implying, on top of the fact that it's an undisclosed statement, and the inconsistency would lend itself to some impeachment. On top of that, it's another bad act. It's essentially, he's saying that she's talking about something as if she's being secretive, she's up to no good, and this just simply isn't something that should be done by surprise in the middle of a trial before the jury.
All right, so the primary defense argument, and I have not had a chance to read the motion yet, but I started it. And I do know that part of their argument is that statements of the defendant, whether or not they're written, but if they're in the possession of the state or the state has knowledge of them, that they need to be disclosed. I don't know if the state has had a chance to read the motion or wants to respond to that particular point in the motion.
Yes, to that particular point, Your Honor, the state is required to turn over recorded or written statements that we have of the witness. I have what defense has regarding this witness, or I guess I should say defense has what we have regarding this witness. I am not aware of any further writings or recordings regarding this witness. Also, what defense is arguing is what cross-examination is for. If they want to impeach him with what's been reported to a detective at some point in the past, they can do that. That's what cross-examination is for. If this witness is now recalling a conversation that he had with Miss Brophy, just because the defense doesn't want the jury to hear it, I mean, that's not a basis for an objection.
Well, I think the disagreement between the sides, if I understand it, because I think in this case, since you've asked if there was anything unusual about the conversation, it seems apparent that the state knew roughly what he was about to say, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I would say I had a rough knowledge. I did not know the extent of it. I would say I had a rough knowledge based on preparing witnesses for trial, like we do in every case, and he was accessible to defense as well.
Right. I think a fundamental difference, I just want to make sure I understand, in the parties' positions is that the defense is of the position that as of January of this year, statements known by the state, whether they're in writing or recorded or not, have to be disclosed. And I think the state's position is they do not have to be. Am I understanding the fundamental difference or not?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
And I would agree with if they are exculpatory, as they cite that, Brady, we certainly would agree with that. If there's anything exculpatory that we have learned in preparation for trial, that we would need to turn that over, whether it's written or not. I mean, I think we certainly understand our Brady obligations.
All right. Well, I have not had a chance to read through this, so this seems like it would be a good time to break for that purpose. And then after I've read it, the sides can make whatever additional argument they want to make. So I think what we'll do, this may take a little longer than 15 minutes. I don't know. I need to go and read this. So I would say with regards to this witness, you don't have to sit there on the stand the whole time. We're going to be in break for at least 15 minutes, maybe 20. And I will alert the parties as soon as I can that I'm ready to retake the bench and hear argument on this motion.
I will go for All right.
All right, please be seated. I have had a chance to read the brief as well as the statutes, so before I guess make a ruling first on this particular question and then maybe some more general comments for the remainder of the trial, I'll ask the sides if there's anything further they want to say, and I'll start with defense.
Not on the legal argument, Your Honor. I think you understand we're making a due process claim in addition to the statutory argument. The only other thing I would add is that obviously any inconsistent statement can lead to impeachment, and it's up to us to decide how we want to use that as impeachment. Clearly, the statement that was given to us is innocuous, and frankly, I think it's something that we probably would have stipulated to in the form in which it was provided to us. This is another bad act. It's a completely different animal than what was provided to us. And we think that the statute is quite clear on its face, and there is, of course, always the due process argument to fall back on.
All right, and does the state want to say anything further?
Just briefly, Your Honor, what defense is referring to in this police report is not actually a prior statement. I mean, there's no recording of this conversation. There's no verbatim documentation from a detective about what Mr. Bresciani is saying. So to say it's a prior inconsistent statement, there's no statement that's being relied on to say that this is now inconsistent with that. And I think that an inquiry to Mr. Bresciani, for one, defense could have done that at any time leading up to this trial. It's my understanding that they never even attempted to contact Mr. Bresciani. He's not refusing to talk with them. And so in addition to I don't think that there's a legal requirement to disclose what I think may happen at trial when there's zero documentation of that. And I think that the cases that they cited and the ORSs that they've cited would certainly require me to do that if they're remotely exculpatory or contradictory to a prior statement. I think I would have to disclose that. And I don't see how this is contradictory or inconsistent.
All right, so first I'm going to rule on this particular statement, and then I'm going to make some more general comments. I do agree that when it comes to what the state's obligation is, unless we're talking about exculpatory material, then the requirement is to provide any written or recorded statements or memoranda of oral statements made by the defendant. So the question then really turns as to whether under ORS 135.815G and the various constitutional arguments that defense has made, so whether this particular statement falls into that category of evidence. I will say I disagree with the state. The absence of a statement, I believe, has been found to equate to a inconsistent statement. However, I do think that defense can impeach this witness by asking this witness about what he spoke with the officer about, and depending on what the answer is, potentially calling the officer back. So with regards to what we have just heard, I'm overruling an objection to the witness's testimony, but what I will say more generally speaking is that, because this is an issue I think that's going to be coming up throughout the trial, I think the state runs a risk if, and I'm using the word if, they're aware of statements that witnesses are attributing to Ms. Brophy which have not been recorded or written, and they're not informing the defense of those statements, because until I hear the actual statement, it's very difficult for me to know ahead of time whether or not it's something that might be used to impeach another witness, whether or not it's something that encompasses a prior act that maybe defense would have a constitutional right to object to before trial. It becomes very difficult. So I'm overruling the objection with regard to this statement, and I certainly agree there are times where neither side knows what a witness is going to say on the stand, but it seems to me, with the statement the witness just made, that the state did have an inclination that something unusual occurred in the conversation with Ms. Brophy. Otherwise, I don't think they would have asked the question, did she say anything unusual, or words to that effect. So I'm just letting the sides know that just because I'm ruling this way on this particular statement, I don't know how I would rule on another. And with that in mind, let's call the jury back.
Your Honor, may I make one more comment? Because
Sure.
Your Honor made me think of something as you were ruling. The failure to disclose this also meant that we lost an opportunity to, in a timely way, impeach Detective Merrill about bias and in the investigation, because the implication of what Mr. Overstreet just said is that it wasn't recorded here, but perhaps Detective Merrill knew that from the beginning, that this had been reported earlier and just didn't show up in Detective Merrill's report. And certainly that would be something that we would want to be impeaching Detective Merrill about, in addition to Mr. Bresciani.
Sure, and that is a potentiality, and I did hear the word timely, but certainly if defense wishes to recall Detective Merrill at some point to ask him about this, that can be done. So let's call the jury back.
Your Honor, before we do that, can we at least have the whole statement, or do we get?
Oh, sure. You
Can
want
the
to?
ambush
Yeah.
continue?
Before we call the jury, and let's hear what the answer is. I thought I had heard it, but let's repeat the question and hear the answer and see if there's anything more before we bring the jury back in.
I'll try to repeat the question as best as I can verbatim. My question was there something about the phone call that made it memorable to you? I don't believe I actually used any terms about that made it odd or something like that, but that made it memorable, stood out to you in some way. Could you recount that, please?
Yeah, I think what I was saying before, what I was trying to say is what stood out and what I recall to the best of my ability is she asked me something along the lines of if somebody's looking for me, or if I'm going to go somewhere, since you have my address or something to that sort, would you give them my personal information? My answer would have been no.
No, you would not help
No.
provide that information.
No, but I just thought that was an odd question. Usually I would encounter that in the past if I worked with the state doing domestic violence moves, which I've done before. That's usually a normal question I get, but this wasn't that case. So.
All right, so that's the full answer. It's similar to what the jury already heard with some slight variation. Is anything defense wants to add to it? I mean, I'll tell you, since there's nothing additional, my inclination would be to let the jury know that I'd overruled the objection and they have the answer they have, rather than re-ask it and retell it. Because it doesn't sound like there's really anything new that is being, what was said before, just so the sides know, is that to the best of my recollection, it was unusual, and that she stated she was a recent widow. We talked about price, and she asked what my policy is on divulging personal information if someone is looking for me. That was the question. We didn't hear what his response was to that, but that's the statement he attributed to Ms. Brophy. So I'm inclined not to allow a rephrasing of that if it's essentially still the same information. Did defense want to say anything on that?
We don't want it repeated.
Okay, all right.
And just, I want to make sure that we're on the same page too, that the additional information of what is your policy, I think is an appropriate question. And furtherance, like, what did you tell her? Meaning that you would not disclose that you would disclose that information if requested.
So the next question would be about what Mr. Bresciani said in response to that. Is there any issue?
What I heard him just say is my answer would have been no. In other words, he doesn't remember what his answer was.
All right. That is what he said at first.
That he doesn't remember what his answer was?
That
No, he said that his policy was no. That he would not have divulged that information.
Right, so the answer is no, but are you trying to get into the further explanation about what he does with domestic violence cases and all of that?
I just want to know what the answer is.
All right.
And I think the jury should hear that is information he shared with Ms. Brophy.
Sure, that the answer was no, if that makes sense. Okay.
That's all.
All right, let's call the jury back.
Okay, I will go ahead and get the jury. Would you like me to keep the record running or turn it off?
We can turn it off.
Okay, we'll go off record and mute for WebEx.
Mr. Overstreet, when you're ready.
Yes, thank you, Judge. Oh, did you want to announce your ruling?
Yes, by the way, do we need your counsel back or?
She'll be back in a second.
She'll be
Okay,
back in just a
all right.
moment.
So before the jury left, there was a question asked regarding what Ms. Brophy said to this witness. An answer was given. I've overruled an objection to the answer. And without repeating what was said earlier, if you want to continue from there, Mr. Overstreet.
Yes, Mr. Bresciani, what was the policy of, at the time, All My Sons moving in regards to disclosing information about a client and where they had gone?
That we would not.
That you would not disclose that information?
That's correct.
Okay. I don't believe I have any further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, cross-examination?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Bresciani, do you remember being interviewed by Detective Merrill on September 6th of 2018?
I remember if I did have an interview that I believe it was one in person, and I feel like there was a follow-up call at some point after that.
And do you recall talking with Detective Merrill the day after Ms. Brophy was arrested?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Do you recall talking with Detective Merrill the day after Ms. Brophy was arrested?
Yes, it would, yes, it would have been the day after,
Okay.
as far as the conversation.
Then there was quite a bit of media attention that day.
No,
Did you see the media coverage about her arrest?
no, I did not.
How did you know it was the day after her arrest?
I was under the assumption that you were asking me that based on the fact that, let me rephrase that. When you asked me that question, the day that I spoke to Miss Brophy, and then you asked me if I talked to the detective after the day after arrest, um, I did not know about her arrest, but before that,
So at the time you talked to the detective, you did not know about her arrest?
he informed me that she was arrested. That's what I remember.
All right.
That she was, I think the verbiage used, and I can't be exact on this because this was, 3.5 years ago, was she's under investigation.
All right. So he focused you appropriately on who Ms. Brophy was.
Um, as far as who she was as, I'm not understanding.
Did he tell you what he was investigating?
I cannot recall that.
Did he tell you he was a homicide detective?
Yes.
Right. So you understood it was a serious investigation.
Yes, I would also add that any time a detective would speak to me in general, I would take that as a serious matter.
I would think so.
Yes.
All right. So on September 6th of 2018, when you talked to Detective Merrill, you recall describing to him that Ms. Brophy had called you sometime, it appears, in late August, so not very long before this interview. And she had arranged with you to move some possessions to 2 pods. Do you recall telling Detective Merrill that?
Yes, that's probably what I said, yeah. I mean, if that's what's in the statement.
And do you recall that being the job?
Yes, now, I mean, the phrase pods, yes, that does, we would have still sent an estimator out to do that. We were partnering with ARC's Best Freight as far as pods, and sometimes we would load pods, but yes.
Okay. And would you explain to the jury what pods are, just in case somebody's not familiar with
Oh,
that term?
yeah, pods, they're containers, 16 feet long usually. And you can either load them yourself or hire somebody to load them and unload them.
So was the job that you were actually hired to do to fill 2 pods for Ms. Brophy?
That I cannot answer because I don't know that question or the answer to that question. I believe what it was is she was inquiring about pricing for long distance.
Okay, I'm going to show you Detective Merrill's report, the one I've been referring to, and
Okay.
let you review it. It begins right down here. It's very, very short. And then the part I'm talking about is right here. It's
Ah.
only a couple sentences. So does that refresh your recollection as to what you told Detective Merrill about what you were hired to do, what you actually did for Ms. Brophy?
Yes.
What was that?
To load 2 pods for her for a long distance trip.
Well, it doesn't say that specifically. Would you like me to show it to you again?
Well, um, I do recall, I will say this, that what I testified is what I remember.
We're talking now, though, about what you told Detective Merrill on September 6th of 2018.
Mhm.
And I'd like you to refer specifically to this part.
Yeah, it says,
You're
sorry.
actually not supposed to read it out
Oh,
loud.
I'm sorry.
You're supposed to ask you questions
Yeah.
after you
Okay.
finish your recollection. All right, having read that, do you recall that there was in fact a move of items into two pods, one 16-foot and one 12-foot, that occurred and that there was a later conversation with Ms. Brophy?
As far as the move actually happening,
That the move happened, the move involved the two pods, filling the two pods?
I don't think it did happen. I think from what I remember, it was a security deposit, and we would have scheduled her on a specified date to move her.
And then, do you recall that there was a later conversation in which she was inquiring about additional pricing, perhaps for a move out of state?
No, I was always under the general, like, as far as what I remember, I recall it just being just one conversation between me and her.
Okay, and you're relying now on memory of what would have happened in August 2018?
It's what stands out, but yeah, I mean, I'm trying to.
Okay, and you had testified earlier that you would have made, I think I'm putting words in your mouth now, but as I understood what you were saying, that you would have made every effort to make sure that you gave Detective Merrill good and complete information about Ms. Brophy, knowing that he was a homicide detective and was contacting you for information about her.
Well, I don't think that's what I said initially. I said that if I spoke to any detective, I would take it seriously. But to answer, I'm not understanding your question specifically.
I'm asking whether at the time you would have made an effort to give Detective Merrill good and complete information about Ms. Brophy, knowing that he was a homicide detective and that he was questioning you about her.
Anytime I interact with law enforcement, I always do my best to give them clear and accurate information to the best of my ability.
Okay, and would you agree that you did not tell Detective Merrill on September 6th of 2018 anything about Ms. Brophy asking you this unusual question that you just relayed?
I did state earlier that I feel like I had a follow-up call. There was an initial interview at the office and then a phone call. So, from my recollection, I do recall telling somebody over the phone, a detective, as far as that information.
Okay, are you agreeing with me that on September 6th of 2018 you did not tell him that?
Um, I'm not agreeing with you. No, if I would have told him that information, so I am surprised it's not in the statement.
Okay, so your testimony is that despite having reviewed his report, you believe that you gave him additional significant information that does not appear in the report I just showed you.
Him or somebody else. I can't recall what he looked like or what his name was until when you keep saying it, but I feel like I did talk to another detective. Whether it was him or somebody on his team, I don't know.
And then, because you work in this industry, you probably understand how this works, but is PODS a company that transports its own units?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so at the time, you're now working for Redefine, but at the time you were working for All My Sons. Would All My Sons have ever had any reason to actually move a PODS unit?
Well, no, we wouldn't move them. With pods, we would offer labor-only services, whether we loaded them or unloaded them. And I mean, there's 56 at that time, there were 56 local offices. So sometimes if we would book a customer loading the pod at the origin, then we would contact the office in a different state, and we would share a cut of that and set up that portion of the move. If somebody was inquiring,
Let me stop you there, though. But you're talking generally now about your business. You're not saying that you recall that being something that has direct relevance to Ms. Brophy.
well, no, that's what my explanation of that was to illustrate how we did it back when I was working at All My Sons Moving.
Right. Okay. So you're not saying that All My Sons would have moved the pods,
No,
and you don't have another specific recollection of the conversation other than that you remember some call with her after the first call where she mentioned something about moving out of state.
I feel as I recollect that I only had one conversation with her, so
So if Detective Merrill has this down as two conversations, he was mistaken, he misunderstood you?
that is possible.
All right, nothing further.
Redirect.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Bresciani, there's been a lot of questions from defense counsel about what's in Detective Merrill's report or what's not in Detective Merrill's report. Did you help Detective Merrill write that report?
No, I did not.
Did he have you review that report?
I was never given the opportunity to review a report that he wrote.
Is it fair to say then you actually have no idea what's in that report until today when you read it for the first time?
That is correct. I've never read that report until today.
So, sir, are you trying, when I asked you questions, and when defense counsel asked you questions, were you trying to independently recall what you remember from your conversations with Ms. Brophy?
That's correct. Yeah.
Now, you talked about these being phone calls with Ms. Brophy. Did you actually ever go out to the Brophy residence?
No.
Were you part of the move? If a move was done, were you part of the team that would have helped with that?
No, I was at that time I was the assistant operations manager
Okay,
there.
so you help organize the moves, take deposits, things like
Yeah,
that.
logistics, clerical work, administrative. Yeah,
Separate teams that go out and actually do the work.
that's correct.
Okay. So if it was done, is your testimony today that you just didn't know that that act had been followed through with?
As far as the move being completed,
Yes.
if that was done, that would have surprised me. From what I'm trying to recall, it was a security. The conversation I had with Ms. Brophy was setting up a move and a security deposit transaction.
And have you reviewed All My Sons records regarding that deposit and a move date and things like that?
No.
Or is this just your recollection?
This is just my recollection.
So if Ms. Brophy, say, called back at a different time, maybe a day or two after you talked to her, and did complete the service agreement, that wasn't you that did it.
That physically performed the move, no.
No, I mean
Oh.
that maybe took the phone call that would have arranged for a move. So let's say she called another location or somebody else at your office answered the phone.
Yeah, I mean, there were multiple people at the office that would have answered the phone. There was also a call center. So anybody could have had an opportunity to book the job or
I
do
see.
anything else with the job itself as far as it being in the system.
And I think you're touching on what I'm trying to clarify here, that if the move did occur and it was because Ms. Brophy called in on another day, your testimony is that that could have happened, but it wasn't you.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And defense counsel asked you something about moving long distance that you didn't, I was a little confused by this, that you didn't disclose that to Detective Merrill. But here today you testified that you thought that she was moving to Arizona or Nevada, but isn't it in Detective Merrill's report that you did tell Detective Merrill that she was moving to Arizona or Nevada?
Yeah, and that is actually in the statement I just read, but I will, if I could touch one more detail on that. We would have given her several different options, and one of them, the most expensive, is if we were to do what was called direct service with our truck, where we wouldn't third party it. The second option would have been to load an ABF trailer, and then we would unload with a different all my son's team and the residing at the destination in the other state. And then the most cheapest option would have been pods, and she would have organized the logistics on that.
You guys offer different levels of service, from
Oh,
just
yeah.
helping out to
Right.
basically doing the full move.
Yeah, there's different options, yeah, at that time that were.
Okay. I think that was it. Thank you very much, Mr. Bresciani.
May the witness be released.
From the state, yes.
What about for defense?
I don't think he's under defense subpoena.
All right. You can be excused.
Thank you.
And the state can call its next witness.
Yes, Your Honor, the state will call Nathaniel Stillwater.
All right, and Mr. Stillwater, if you can step into the witness box, but don't have a seat just yet, and raise your right hand, and we'll give you an oath.
Under the penalty of perjury, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, then you may be seated and you may remove your mask. And then because we're being recorded, please state and spell your first and last name.
Sure. Nathaniel Stillwater, Nathaniel, Stillwater, Stillwater.
All right, and as I think you're aware, there is water there if you want it. Now, when the state is ready, they can inquire.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Stillwater, we're going to put up what's marked as State's Exhibit 59 just in a moment. Oh, okay. Well, I'll just ask some questions. Mr. Stillwater, obviously we've heard some testimony about your father, but Dan Brophy is your father.
That's correct.
And what is your biological mother's name?
Perla Stillwater.
Has your mother also recently passed?
She has.
When was that?
It was June of 2021.
Do you have recollection from your childhood about when your father Dan and Perla were married?
Yes,
At some point, did they get a divorce?
they did.
How old were you when they divorced?
I would have been 13 years old.
After your parents divorced, did you go to live with one of them, or did you go to live with other family members?
I stayed living with my mother.
And did that continue until you were an adult?
That's correct.
During that time that you were living with your mother, did you still see your father regularly?
No, we had a little bit. I'd say initially I would see him occasionally, and then there was, I think, a good amount of resentment on my mother's behalf that they had separated. And then the following year, she suffered an accident that left her physically limited. And I think that sort of exacerbated that sense of abandonment. I'm not really sure how else to phrase that. So
you're upset.
sort of drove that wedge a little further between my father and I.
Okay. And at that time, you were becoming around 14, 15.
That's correct.
And so during that time, did you not see him so much or speak with him very much?
That's correct.
And did that change in the future?
It did. Around my 21st birthday, I was working, a coworker of mine, her fiance or husband had matriculated through the Western Culinary Program and was familiar with my father and with Nancy. I believe he may have even been an employee of Nancy's at the time. and kind of took it upon himself to reconnect us.
And I'm sorry, you said that was a friend of yours?
It was a gal that I worked with, her fiance or partner, husband, I'm not quite sure what their marital status was at the time, but he sort of facilitated reaching out to my father, and it would have been right around my 21st birthday.
Okay. And how old are you now?
42.
So around your 21st birthday, and how was that facilitated?
I don't really know the ins and outs of it. I believe he reached out either to Nancy or to my father directly. Like I said, I'm unclear on whether he was working for Nancy currently or if that somehow got him a position at her catering company at the time. I don't recall.
And yeah, and maybe not the details behind the scenes because you might not have been privy to it, but more or less, what was the event or what happened that did bring you two together?
Yeah, I think it just kind of sparked the conversation and got the ball rolling on us having rekindling some conversation. And, shortly after that, we found time to get together and then sort of took it from there and found more opportunities to spend time together and get reacquainted, myself as a young adult and getting to learn more about him and where he was at.
And did that sort of relationship continue to grow?
It did, yeah. I'd say we spent increased amounts of time together, learning more about his hobbies, his interests, kind of figuring out where they coalesced and met with my own and took some trips together. Wouldn't have been too long after that. I actually took a position working for Nancy at her catering company. And I think that really sort of accelerated the opportunities to spend time with him, just seeing him in passing, whether he was helping out at her shop or, just having more day-to-day interaction.
And did you two, throughout the years, from say 21 forward, is it safe to say you grew pretty close?
Yeah.
And we're going to now show you State's Exhibit 59. Nice backdrop.
I don't understand.
Is it a shared? Yeah.
I should be able to.
Continue working on that. I'll ask you some more questions. So you talked about Nancy a little bit and the fact that you went to work at her catering company.
Correct.
How long did you work for Nancy?
On and off, probably about 6 years. There was a gap where I left Chef de Jour Catering and worked for a classmate of hers who had a cafe down in Old Town. And so would still pick up some catering gigs occasionally, but my Monday through Friday was at Spring Hollow Cafe.
You have children?
I do.
How old is your oldest child?
10.
Did Dan and Nancy become close with your oldest child?
They did.
Were they pretty involved in her life?
They were. Dan and Nancy, and also my grandparents at that time. I was working, I was a manager at a restaurant, and so had kind of really extreme hours, from closing to opening. And my daughter's mother was substitute teaching for the Beaverton School District. And so it's sort of all lined up where, we were able to get some childcare for my eldest daughter through my grandparents a day a week, and then through my father and Nancy another day. And then I was able to fill in on the off days by either working nights or having that be a day off.
Definitely a team, family effort.
It was, very much.
And sorry the timing on this, but we're showing you now State's Exhibit 59. Is that a photograph of you and your father?
It is.
And I think we're seeing what we're now becoming famous bolo ties. Did
Yeah.
you know about your father's bolo tie habit?
Yeah, it dates back quite a while.
Okay. He had quite a few.
He did have quite a few.
And you obviously both dressed very nicely there, even though that picture looks like it maybe was taken out in the woods. But did you accompany your father sometimes going out, doing some of the things that you've heard about, the mushroom hunting, the foraging, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Not necessarily dressed like this, but yeah.
That's not, not in a suit. Um, did you yourself or did your father ever express any concern while out foraging or looking for mushrooms about his personal safety?
Never while we were out. He, always had some stories to tell. I believe matatakis were a specific mushroom varietal that saw some action. I think it depended on the global market. It was something like if Japan's bounty wasn't as rich, then the Oregon crop became more valuable. And so there could be some dust ups. I don't remember him ever speaking about an incident specifically that he was involved in, but
That's kind of my next question is, did he ever report to you that he had some, physical interaction, just an argument with somebody while out foraging?
not to my knowledge. I think it was just parking lot talk.
Now I asked about your one child. Do you have more than one child?
I do.
Um, at the time of your father's death, was your wife pregnant?
She was.
And were Dan and Nancy, sorry, your father and Nancy, were they aware of that pregnancy?
I believe we had just made them aware a week or two prior.
Did your father ever talk about, well, let me ask you this. How did he feel about being a grandfather?
I think he was very proud. He took it pretty seriously. While he had like I think he's been known for a very dry sense of humor. He was also very affectionate and very like fun with my daughter. A lot of his coworkers have great stories to recount about his time with them and how much he enjoyed spending that time.
Was he ever, was he always present when he was watching the grandchildren or even just around the grandchildren, not necessarily babysitting them? Was he present or was he the guy or the grandpa that goes sit in the other room and kind of ignore everybody?
I mean, to my knowledge, he was present as much, if he was home. I imagine some of that time occurred while he was teaching in school or might otherwise have been pulled away.
And just what about your own observations? I mean, when the grandchildren would be or grandchild would be around, was he interactive with
Yeah,
it?
I felt like he was very involved.
Said you helped Nancy with her catering, or you actually worked for her catering business for a while.
That's correct.
Did you also ever help your dad or your grandfather Jack delivering food, picking up stuff from the OCI? Kind of this volunteering work that your grandfather seems to be very involved in. Did you ever help out with that?
Not to the degree that my father did. No, I think him, being very hands-on with food that was available to be donated, really positioned him much better to. We were very aware and supportive of the work that my grandparents were doing, but were less hands-on than he was.
Understood. Thanks. Did you get to spend a lot of time with your father one-on-one without Nancy being around, without other people being around?
Yeah, I would say that, we made it to a fair share of family dinners, where obviously everybody was there, but otherwise I'd say a lot of the time that we spent together would be more on a one-on-one basis, whether it was helping with a project or going out, on an adventure.
And you mentioned a couple trips together. Do you actually travel together, or do you mean trips like the day trips out to the coast or day trip out to forage or whatever?
Sure, there'd be some day trips. We We also took a trip down to Northern California to take a mushroom seminar that was being put on. Paul Stamets was one of the speakers there, and I know that that was somebody that was a speaker of interest for him. I think he's made some notoriety recently with a documentary that just came out, but it was really very interesting to hear him speak.
So this is like a overnight trip, at least a couple days, maybe?
A few days, yeah, it was like a camp.
Oh, okay. And any other trips together, travel-wise? I mean,
I'd say not more than an overnight, yeah.
what about just hanging out? Just hanging out and watch TV, just talking, having a
Yeah,
beer together?
he wasn't real big on watching TV, but we would like go catch a film occasionally. He enjoyed cinema, or go help with projects. You know, there was always something to be done. So often he would call and see if I'd be willing to come out and lend a hand for a couple hours. But it was good opportunity to catch up. You know, whether it was retiring chickens or, you know, he would often um, produce turkeys, you know, prior to the Thanksgiving holiday, and then there would be some amount of work required to get those ready to be ready to go to customers that were interested in them.
Did retire chickens?
Sure, that's the polite way of saying
Okay,
it, I
I'm
guess.
just making sure I think I understood. Good at that. I mean, it sounds like when you did kind of, what I'm phrasing is hang out with your father, more or less you're helping him with stuff. He seems to be a pretty busy guy. Is that fair?
He was always active. You know, I had moved to Michigan while I was working for an advertising company, and things kind of fell apart. And I came back to Portland and actually stayed with my father and Nancy for, you know, I can't remember exactly. It was during the time that they had the fire in their basement. You know, I would estimate it was about 6 months or so. And yeah, he just was a very busy individual. He would be up, you know, before sunrise, getting things ready, taking care of chickens, and then would make it off to school. And then by the time he made it home, it was chores in the garden, getting dinner ready, and then, you know, reading a book before falling asleep. So there wasn't a lot of quit in him.
Yeah. Did he also get up early?
Yes.
Was he, I mean, we've heard quite a bit about his routines and things, but from your perspective, did he seem the guy that seemed pretty regimented in his day?
Yeah, I'd say fairly, if not very structured.
I know that it's kind of a vague question because it could probably depend on what's going on that day, but if it was a day that he was just normally going to work, say at the Culinary Institute or something like that, did you kind of experience the same routine on a day-to-day basis?
I believe that's accurate.
You said you kind of grew closer with your father, and did you guys share personal details with each other?
Occasionally, you know, he wasn't, I'd say, kind of a carryover from my childhood is that he didn't speak a lot about his feelings necessarily. He was always approachable if there was something he wanted to talk about. I mean, remember several instances that kind of came up as a young adult where I sought his input and he was more than happy to give it, but wasn't necessarily going to just be volunteering it, whether that was because he was concerned he was speaking out of place or I couldn't really tell you, but it was, you know, I feel like we had a strong friendship as well as a, you know, father-son relationship.
Did you look up to him a little bit?
Absolutely.
Now, what about with Nancy? Did you ever have kind of any of those same personal conversations with Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, I worked side by side with her for a number of years, so got to know her, so I thought, pretty well.
Yeah. Did either of them talk to you about anything involving their relationship with each other?
No.
And, we talked about your father being a grandfather to your child. Yeah, what about Nancy? Did she take on the role of a grandmother
Actively.
actively? Did you appreciate that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you feel that you had a pretty good relationship with Nancy leading up to 2018?
Yes.
Did either your father or Nancy ever disclose to you that they were struggling financially?
No, we never spoke about money. I couldn't have told you the first thing about their finances or what their financial trajectory was.
Neither of them spoke about it with you?
That's correct.
Okay. And did they, this probably goes hand in hand with that last question. Did you ever loan them money?
No. No. I believe after my father passed, there was a brief moment where my wife and I wanted to make sure that Nancy was financially secure, and we offered to loan her money. But I think that it proved to be unnecessary.
Did she decline?
She did.
At any time after your father's death, did Nancy talk to you about money at all?
I mean, I took the first week off after his passing, just to kind of process and to also make myself available to Nancy to help out as much as possible. There was a lot to do, and I wasn't sure where she was at in terms of, obviously she just suffered this big loss, and so we weren't sure how much support she really needed, and knew that there was a lot to do. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I got a little sidetracked.
Yeah, no, it was really, was she discussing with you after your father's death finances? And specifically, I guess I'll ask a more specific question. What she was going to do now without Daniel's income?
Yeah, there was a certain point where clearly something had changed. Like as I said, we had touch base periodically to see if she needed money or to make sure that she was going to be able to make the nut on the house. And I remember, we were in her van. I don't know if we were moving an item or something, but she relayed that, something had worked out, and the coffers had been refilled, and she was in good financial shape at that point.
She thought and that was sometime after your father's death.
Yeah, putting the timeline together, I don't know if that was cashing out his 401k or where that source came from, or if that was, a payment from Safe, but money was starting to flow in, and she seemed much calmer and at ease financially.
But before that, she wasn't necessarily complaining about it or saying that she was struggling.
Not to my recollection. I don't know that complaining would be the word I would use.
It's probably not the right way to phrase it at all, but
I think that there was some anxiety about money and where it might be coming from.
did that seem to increase throughout the summer until this point where she relayed to you that money was coming in?
I wouldn't even say, excuse me, I wouldn't even say through the summer. I think that was resolved within the first few weeks.
Oh, I see. Okay. Were you aware that Nancy was in the business of selling life insurance at some point?
Yes.
And did you have personal one-on-one conversations with Nancy about life insurance?
Several.
And what are kind of some of the context of those conversations?
When I had moved back from Michigan, I had bought a property there, and she had encouraged me to consider life insurance while even though I was no longer living there, we were renting that property out. So she had suggested a life insurance policy as a way to kind of protect my end of that investment. And at the time it made sense and was affordable. So took her recommendation and I believe I purchased a different life insurance policy through Foresters, maybe several years later. Not in addition to, but replacing the original.
Do you recall, so I just want to make sure I understand it, because you owned a property, was the idea that if you were to pass, that your family would be able to maintain that property?
Correct, or at least my interest in that property.
Sure, you're interested in it. It sounds like it was maybe an investment of some sort.
Yeah, I had bought it with another individual whom I was not married to, but we were co-signers.
I see. And so your family would be able to maintain that interest in that property with this life insurance policy?
Correct.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. And so, do you recall the amount of that life insurance policy?
I don't think it was for a significant amount of money, maybe $75,000 to $100,000.
And was there a significant cost for that?
No, I would say less than $100 a month. So I'm not 100% on that.
And was that the only policy that you purchased through Nancy?
At that time, and then I later purchased a Forester's policy, which.
That was also with Nancy?
Correct.
Oh, okay, got it. So the first one you purchased, and then you said you replaced it with the Forester's policy.
Correct.
Was that for a higher amount?
I think it was actually less coverage. I just looked at that recently because we just redid insurance in our household for like auto and renters. So in taking a look at it, I don't know that it was the strongest choice for us. So
Was it cheaper maybe, or?
nominally, if.
Okay, all right. And that was as a replacement?
Correct.
Did Nancy encourage you to buy more policies than those?
No.
And did you go out and seek other life insurance to supplement that?
No. Recently, I've kind of revisited all of this, and as I said, we just redid our automotive and renters policies, and so as a part of that, I had shopped around some of their life policies, but we haven't made any decisions yet.
Okay, so currently you haven't made any new decisions regarding how much life insurance you need?
Correct.
Is it fair to say that your insurance needs probably have changed since you bought that policy?
I would
First
say
one.
that is very safe to say. Yeah.
Okay. Now you have several children and a spouse.
Correct.
Did she ever talk about, and whether it's the time that she's talking to you about why you should buy life insurance or anything like that, but or any time around there, did she talk about how much she was insured by way of an example?
Not to my recollection.
And same question about your father. Did she talk to you about how much life insurance she was carrying on your father?
No. I mean, I assumed that they both carried life insurance policies, but I wouldn't have had a clue about what or for how much.
And assuming, because based on that answer, you did not have that conversation with your father either?
That's correct.
He never disclosed how many life insurance policies he thought that he had on himself?
No.
Or how many were out on Nancy?
No.
So I mean, you've probably answered this question with that line of answers, but did Nancy not tell you that you were in fact the secondary or contingent beneficiary on numerous policies on your dad's life?
I was not aware of that.
Gotten quite a bit of testimony about property, your father's backyard. It's been described in various ways. What was your impression of what your dad had going on in his backyard?
I don't know if there's a straight answer. I think that it evolved over the years. I think that it was always kind of a work in progress. As his interests varied, slash if there was a potential to produce a crop that would be attractive to a restaurant or a market, you know, he would kind of adapt and change his planting habits or amount of space allocated for that. But there was always, it was a strong ecosystem, to put it lightly. I mean, they talk about these sinks being sunk into the earth, and those were like water gardens to grow rice in. I mean, it was really pretty special. I think Woody put it well in that if you just walked back there, it would look like chaos, but once you started to take note of the symbiosis that was occurring back there, it really was a pretty remarkable feat.
And did you experience that yourself?
Yeah, absolutely.
What about just, you know, did your father think that it was a mess?
No, I mean, I think he could certainly understand when there was time that there was some work that needed to be done. You know, blackberries were a particular nuisance that were recurring and took, you know, I would say at least twice a year. Took some effort.
Did you ever help with that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, really, at any time, if your father or even Nancy called you and said they needed help with something like that or anything else that you thought you could help with, did you help them?
I would say I made my best effort. Yeah, I mean, there were certainly times where it didn't line up, but we, I would say, in a show of appreciation for the help that they were providing us with my daughter, like we certainly tried to make ourselves available to help when and where I could.
Did you see your grandfather over there quite a bit helping out too?
Absolutely.
Talked about your dad being sort of a chronic, this is my term, chronically busy guy. Always on the move, always doing something. You two ever have a conversation, whether in passing or a sit down, serious conversation about his future?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think the year prior to his murder was when the idea that they were interested in selling the house was initially presented. Um, I think, you know, my grandparents and I were all a little surprised by that, and I think everybody did some quizzing independently, and uh, you know, the answer I got from him was that they needed to find more of a ranch style home. Nancy was having an issue with a hip or a knee, I don't recall, but the staircase was posing a problem or was forecasted to pose a problem. And so, you know, asking him, well, what's the next move? You know, I think, you know, to the best of my recollection, some property that was a little bit more manageable with a smaller home and a garden really was going to be something he was interested in.
That's what your father told you.
Correct.
What did Nancy tell you?
Nancy had a little bit more of an elaborate idea of, I think, you know, maybe trying the expat lifestyle, traveling to Spain, Portugal. Uh, you know, I got the sense that nobody really knew what the next move was. You know, which seemed confusing if they were going to focus a lot of energy to sell the house, to have that much ambiguity in terms of what their unified concept of the next move was didn't really gel with any of us or make a lot of sense.
When you're saying you're having these conversations with your father and separate conversation with Nancy and getting kind of two different answers here, do you remember about how long before your father's death that was?
It would have been, excuse me, I believe the year prior is when those conversations started.
2017.
Sounds right.
Did those conversations continue, or did they increase, or did they kind of fall off? What's your recollection of that?
I mean, I think I quizzed him a couple times just because I was hoping to get a more concrete answer, but at a certain point, I may have just sort of stopped asking and figured it would become apparent, or we would just be informed when a decision had been made.
Were you ever informed?
No.
Did it ever become more apparent what their plan was as time went on leading up to your father's death?
No.
Did it appear to you as if they were actually getting ready to sell their home leading up to your father's death?
Hard to say. You know, I would say that there was a shift in his interest in the backyard. I think my grandmother put it best in that there were, Dan had changed, and I think it was evident. Like you could see that he just was not spending as much time in the backyard, and was more preoccupied with other things. But to look at the basement, to look at the garage, like there was not a lot of effort being made to prepare to move.
And, I don't want you to comment necessarily on what your grandfather said, but just from your own perspective, what were you noticing, if anything, about your father that would cause you to say something like that?
I just noticed that sorry, like the blackberries in particular were just especially out of hand. Like whether he'd missed a planting or just wasn't, as involved in the backyard. I hadn't realized until, I'm not sure how long he'd been working at Avamere before I realized that he was working 2 jobs. So,
That's not something he disclosed to you.
he may have, but I don't know that I put 2 and 2 together necessarily and realized it was in conjunction with his teaching at Oregon Culinary. Wasn't sure if he'd like taken a sabbatical or taken some time away, and so it took some time to realize that it was a second job for him. But no, I didn't see any real concrete steps towards preparing to sell the house. Other than I know that the initial plan was to try and have the property zoned differently. So I think that that's sort of where I had left it in my mind, that they were working with the county to see what it would take to have infrastructure put in, water, electric, and to have that zoned as a separate residential lot.
And were you under the impression that they were actually trying to work with somebody to get that developed?
I had heard that, yes.
But you don't know if they actually ever followed up with anybody to make that happen?
I think ultimately, and this may have been after his passing, I heard that it may have been more work or cost prohibitive to complete that process.
And when you say you heard that from Nancy, or
I believe that would have been from Nancy, correct?
so was the impression that you got that she had sought out information but determined that it was going to be too expensive? I mean, is that the general?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you how involved, if at all, my father was, but that's, I believe, who I had learned that information from.
In general, did you get the impression that your father did want to sell the house and move?
No, I'm gonna object. It calls for speculation.
It's a general impression. I'll allow him to answer the question.
No, I didn't get the impression that was his interest. But, as I said, he had sold it to me as a necessary change due to Nancy's health. So I think it was one of those bitter pills he was willing to swallow.
Okay, so something that was for Nancy.
Right.
Did your dad specifically talk to you about a retirement plan that he had?
No.
Did Nancy talk to you about a retirement plan that they had?
Not that they had, no. I mean, aside from her sort of vision of globetrotting and writing and visiting Europe, but none of that was concrete. It all seemed very ethereal.
So on that, I mean, were you under the impression that when she's talking about this globetrotting, traveling, that she was talking about doing that in retirement, meaning they weren't going to be continuing to work when they were doing that?
It was all pretty unclear.
Okay. Your dad never told you about any plans to leave his job at the Oregon Culinary Institute or at Avamere, even though you didn't really know about the job?
There was no concrete date or year given as to his expectation to retire. Not that I was aware of.
After your father's death, were you pretty involved in helping Nancy move things, prepare the house for sale?
Yeah, I took I took a week off of work and really just wanted to make myself available to her and to my grandparents, but I would say specifically to Nancy to try and help out. I knew that there was a lot that needed to be done, but I also, I think, was concerned just for her well-being and having lost a partner. You know, obviously at that point in time, we didn't know what had happened. And so I know that she had a friend circle and a support network, but I just wanted to make myself available.
And after your father's death, did Miss Brophy ever tell you or indicate to you where she had been the morning of your father's murder?
I'm not I spoke to her the day of the murder eventually. It was later in the day when I finally did speak to her. Um, I'm not positive that I was ever given the official rundown of events.
Okay. Do you recall testifying previously in another proceeding in this case?
Yes.
This is a 4770. I'm not going to have you read this out loud. Just keep it to yourself. Corrections, yeah. Help refresh your memory as to what Miss Brophy told you regarding her whereabouts the morning of your father's murder.
Yes. I was led to believe that she was at home that morning.
Additionally, did she provide any information about how she was actually downtown that morning?
No.
Are you the executor of your father's estate?
That's correct.
So as the executor, were you involved in the sale of your father and Nancy's home?
I was.
I'm going to show you what's marked as State's Exhibit 77 in a minute. It's referred to as a seller's net sheet. And when we bring that up, I'll give you a chance to look at it. I'm actually going to show you something else while we're doing that. Do you recognize that photo?
I do.
Is that a picture of your father?
It is.
And who is that with her?
My eldest daughter.
While we're working on State's Exhibit 77, I'm going to ask you some other questions, Mr. Stillwater. Are you yourself a gun owner?
I am.
Do you know about how many firearms you owned in 2018?
2018, I would say 6 or 7.
And how many years have you been a gun owner?
Since I was 18, I kind of got interested. I was always involved in scouting growing up, and pursued scouting through the rank of Eagle Scout, but through summer camps, just had a strong interest in target shooting. And then that turned into an interest in hunting. deer and waterfowl. So I had a variety of long guns to that end.
And out of the 6 or 7 firearms that you own, are they various types of firearms, meaning handguns, shotguns, rifles, things like that?
That's correct.
And each of the firearms that you've ever purchased, how did you purchase them?
Went to a gun store, filled out the federal form. I'm forgetting what the number is on that one, but assigned my identification and social security number.
For each firearm?
Correct. Actually, I believe my shotgun may have, it was a gift from my mother. It may technically be registered in her name.
Okay. And on each one of those, maybe minus the shotgun that was gifted to you, was a background check performed?
Each and every time.
Have you ever purchased a ghost gun or a build kit?
I have never purchased a unregistered, unserialized weapon of any kind.
There was some mention in opening statements that you had purchased or had actually completed a build kit of some degree. Is that true?
That is inaccurate. I bought a receiver set to build a AR-style rifle capable for bench shooting. So my research had led me to believe it was more cost-effective to piece this together by buying purposeful parts than to buy a fully assembled.
When you say bench shooting, is that target?
Correct,
practice?
yeah. Long-range bench shooting at a shooting range.
That also can be competition, correct?
Correct.
So when we're talking about piecing together a gun, there still are parts that you have to buy that are serialized and you have to get a background check?
Absolutely. And
And you-
yeah, none of it's in a kit form. These are individual components that you buy with intention for a specific purpose.
And those can also be purchased at gun stores?
They can.
Did you ever purchase a, well, you already answered that. Did your father and Nancy know that you had firearms and specifically multiple firearms?
To my knowledge, yes.
I mean, did you ever mention it to them or something?
Yes.
Did you know whether or not your father and Nancy had a firearm themselves?
I was not aware of that fact until I was interviewed by Detectives Posey and Merrill.
After your father's death?
Correct.
Did you ever have a conversation with your father about his desire or, I guess, lack of a desire to own a firearm?
Never. He never expressed interest in owning a firearm.
Did he ever discuss firearms with you?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I believe he did some deer hunting when he was younger. I think this would have been even before I was born. But that would have been the extent of it. He never expressed any interest in shooting as a hobby or firearms in general.
Had he come to you and said, hey, I'm interested in firearms, can I look at yours? Would that have been a possibility?
100%.
What about testing them out? Like, he doesn't know what he wants, so maybe he could shoot some of yours and see what he likes?
Yeah, in fact, one of the customers that we had owned an indoor gun range, and she would have been more than happy to let him try whatever he was interested in.
And same thing with Nancy? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
that would have been open to her as well? I've only talked to you about what your father has said about firearms. Did you ever have any conversations with Nancy about firearms?
The only conversation I recall would have been several years prior, so I want to say 2015, 16. I believe she was working on a book and was interested in knowing what a character may have carried that was in the military. It's the best of my recollection.
Okay.
I think I gave her a brief rundown, and then also that information is pretty publicly available.
for that book, The Wrong Seal?
I couldn't tell you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought you knew which book
No.
it was part of. Okay. So she approached you, asked you some questions about what type of
Yeah,
gun.
it was after like a family dinner or something. Just made it, not made it seem, she just mentioned that that was something that she was working on if I had any input.
And did you provide it?
I think I gave a loose sketch, but then, yeah, also was like, I'm not 100%. It's certainly public information that you could look up.
And she was asking you specifically about a military style weapon.
Right.
Okay. Have you been in the military?
I've not.
Okay. So you wouldn't have that knowledge necessarily about what the military would carry.
Correct.
And that was a few years prior.
To my knowledge.
Had Nancy come to you recently and asked you about certain firearms, would you have discussed that with her, especially in the context of her writing?
Prior to my father's murder, yes, absolutely.
So if in 2017, let's say, mid to late 2017, she had an idea for a book regarding firearms, she could have come to you and discussed that with you?
There would have been no reason not to.
Okay. So, do you recall a family gathering sometime in, I'm not even going to put a time frame on it. Do you recall a family gathering ever where your, say, uncles were there, Dan and Nancy, yourself, possibly even Jack and Karen, where there was a general or broad discussion regarding firearms and sort of surveying each family member on who had firearms?
Is this a trip to the coast?
Well, I'm going to leave it open because I don't seem to think that we're getting much of a clear answer on what.
Yeah,
What
that's the
happens?
only trip I can think of that would have involved an uncle. I mean, I had two uncles here after my father's passing, but that's the only trip I can think of where one uncle and his spouse was here. There was a trip to, I want to say Astoria, and it would have been, it, we, my wife and I and eldest daughter did not stay, only because I don't believe there was accommodations for that many folks. So we came out, it would have been October because we stopped at the Halloween town for my daughter on the way out for her to kind of have some fun, and then came out for the day and visited. But aside from my speaking to my uncle Bill, who is a firearm collector, I don't recall there being any kind of Q&A about firearms. I didn't, not that I was aware of. Then again, we didn't spend the evening there, so.
Fair enough. And you mentioned your one uncle Bill, a firearm enthusiast as well. You've had conversations with him about firearms,
I believe so.
and you have another uncle as well.
I do.
And does he also have firearms, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
And these two uncles that you're referencing, those would be your father's brothers?
Correct.
Now, I asked you about firearms in relation to Nancy's writings, but did you ever hear from your father or Nancy a concern that they had regarding recent school shootings?
No.
Assuming your schedule would have allowed it, if Nancy had asked you to accompany her to a gun show, are you familiar with the gun shows that are held at the Expo Center? Let me ask you that.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you been to them before?
I've been to one or two, yeah.
Safe to say, I mean, it's an expo center, but it's a very large room, lots of different guns,
Correct.
and for sale.
Right.
Okay. If your schedule would have allowed it and Nancy had asked you to accompany her in order to help identify a firearm that would be best suited for her, would you have done that?
Yes.
Did she ask you that?
No.
Did you even know she had gone to a gun show?
No.
Now, after, I'm going to take you to about March or April of 2018. Did Nancy ever discuss with you about, well, I don't, let me go back to January to April 2018. Did Nancy ever come to you and discuss with you a build kit that she had actually purchased and might need some help with?
Never.
After your father's death, did Nancy ever disclose to you that she had purchased any firearm?
No.
How were you notified of your father's death?
I was called by my grandmother. I've struggled to recall the time exactly, but I believe it was between 9:30 and 10 a.m. on that Saturday. My wife and I were at Rockaway Beach, staying at a friend's home. Kate was taking a nap, and I remember my grandmother calling and saying there had been a shooting at OCI, but she did not have any more information.
You think that was around 9:30?
I believe it was about 9:30 to 10. I'm not 100%. And I guess to finish answering your question, so I tried messaging and calling both Nancy and my father numerous times. I actually sat on hold with police non-emergency for, I'm not even sure how long, I would say 20 to 30 minutes before realizing that that wasn't really going to get me anywhere anyway. So I ended the call, and shortly after that, my grandmother called me again to say that my father had been shot. Her words were, "Your sweet daddy." It was "your sweet daddy," which stands out in my mind because I'd never heard him referred to in that way before. He'd always been my father. Those words will be seared in my mind.
Did you get a hold of Nancy that morning?
Eventually.
Did you call her or did she call you?
I don't recall exactly who got a hold of who. I know that it was perhaps hours after that notification from my grandmother.
Your calls to Nancy went unanswered?
Correct. Then, as I said, I don't know exactly who eventually got a hold of who. It very well may have been me calling her or her calling me back. I believe it was at least an hour after speaking to my grandmother that second time.
Said you remembered calling your father's phone several times.
That's correct.
Do you remember about how many times you tried?
I don't. It really was kind of a blur. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a dozen. It could have been 4, you know. I know that there was calls and messages made.
You had mentioned something about your father, something had changed, specifically in regards to how he was tending to the yard or the garden. Did Nancy ever mention to you that she thought Dan had changed as well?
Yeah, she had made that comment to me once or twice. Just, I think it was very general. You know, your father has changed, which I couldn't necessarily disagree with. I mean, he certainly appeared to be taking more of an interest in watching sports and less on backyard garden projects.
Did Nancy ever call you or come to you and ask you how you were doing in dealing with your father's death?
Not to my recollection. Again, I spent the first 2 weeks following pretty close to her. I remember asking her if she was receiving any counseling, but I don't know that that question was ever posed to me.
I think that's it for, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, we wanted to look at the exhibit that I said I was gonna go to, so before I
Alright.
let you go, we're gonna take a look at State's Exhibit 77. This is what's titled, I think it's titled somewhere, a seller's net sheet. Have you seen this document before?
I'm sure I have.
Okay. And is this just documenting the sale of the home that you were a part of as the executor of the estate?
Right. Yeah, 5-3.
I don't have any other questions, but I would move to admit, actually, that's already admitted, is 59?
No.
I would just move to admit State's Exhibit 59.
Any objection to 59?
Oh, none, I'm sorry. I thought it was already in.
50, yeah, I don't know. 59 will be admitted if it's not.
And I believe 77 is already admitted.
I think it is too, but if it isn't, it'll be admitted as
Okay,
well.
thank you, Judge.
And that was your final question, right?
It was, Your Honor, thank you.
All right, cross-examination?
Good morning, Mr. Stillwater.
Good afternoon.
Oh, it's always morning in my brain. Good afternoon. You testified that there came a time that you noticed a change in your dad, that he was watching more sports and maybe spending less time in his garden.
I believe that's accurate.
Do you remember whether during the winter and spring of, I guess, December of 2017 through the spring of 2018, whether your dad and Nancy had hired some landscapers to come in and help with some of the blackberries?
That could be true.
Do you recall your dad talking about two people who he called the yard warriors?
I remember that name being thrown around.
Okay. Your dad would sometimes come up with, I don't know if it's affectionate, but just kind of kind labels for people or names for people.
Yeah, the house cleaner was Running Bear, as I recall.
Running Bear. While your dad maybe was spending more time watching sports and less time in his garden, his kindness and appreciation of his wife never changed, did it, from your perspective?
Not to my knowledge.
He took very good care of her.
I believe that's accurate.
He made her lovely meals.
Nightly.
And I think one of the things that you had said when you testified before the grand jury is that they always laughed together.
That's something I would say.
They appreciated each other's sense of humor.
Are you quoting my grand jury testimony here?
No, I'm
Or
not
you're
now. I'm just asking if that's true, that you observed that they appreciated each other's sense of humor.
I believe that's accurate.
Okay. Your father had a very, very dry sense of humor. Is that right?
That's correct.
But if a person appreciated that, he was hilarious. Is that true?
That is true.
You testified that your dad did talk to you about the fact that there maybe was a plan to move.
Correct.
And from your perspective, that Nancy and Dan appeared to have a, quote, united front with respect to that plan?
United in the sense that they had decided to sell the home. Not united. I don't believe I was speaking to what the end game was,
Sell the home, but then what happened? That was still under negotiation?
to my understanding.
Okay. And Ms. Brophy was talking about how much fun it would be to be an expat or to go to Europe. Is
Correct.
that right? And your dad, meanwhile, wanted to have a patch of land that he could keep gardening.
I think that was always his vision.
Okay. So if there was a disagreement, it really was a pretty benign disagreement about what would happen after the property was sold.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I would categorize it as a disagreement. I think that I was just giving two different versions of what um, they might have thought of their next move.
Okay. And really, that what you're describing here had a lot to do with kind of their difference in your personalities. Ms. Brophy would tend to get kind of excited about things like that, and your dad was just a little bit more steady and, I don't know, we wouldn't call him bubbly, right?
I mean, that could be true. I don't know.
Okay, okay. You discussed the guns that you owned, and I may have misunderstood, but I think what you're saying is that you built an AR-15, but you didn't build it from a kit.
That's correct.
Can you tell me, just describe for me the process?
Sure. So I was interested in building a rifle that would be accurate as a bench rest rifle.
What's that? And again, I'm gun stupid. What's a bench rest rifle?
Sure, it's a firearm you might not take hunting necessarily. It's impractical to carry around. Its job is to sit on a bench and to be able to shoot small, accurate groups at long distances.
Okay. So you're interested in creating that sort of a firearm. Can you tell me the steps that you followed to create that?
Sure, I surveyed some folks in the community that have a similar interest in the hobby. Did some research on some brands to figure out, like who made a barrel that would accomplish that task, what a reliable receiver set might look like, and then purchased all the individual components to assemble it for, I would say half the cost of going out and buying something that was made specifically for that task.
Okay. So, is AR-15 a brand or just a type of gun?
No, I think it's just a general term that gets thrown around through the media. I'm not even sure. I think it's based on the original AR Stoner design, which would have been the M16 rifle.
Okay. But you bought all the various individual parts separately and then put the gun together for less money than it would have cost to buy the gun as a whole unit?
That's correct.
And each one of these parts, did you buy them all at one time or?
Not necessarily.
And were they all purchased within a local gun store?
The majority.
Okay. And what wasn't?
I don't recall off the top of my head.
The parts that you didn't buy at a local gun store, did you buy online?
I believe I did buy the optic online.
And did you ever talk to anybody about how you'd put this gun together from parts?
Yeah, I have a friend of mine who's a nurse who had actually inspired me to do this build.
Okay. Did you ever talk to your dad about it?
I may have mentioned it.
You testified that there was a time that you remember being at the beach and you said you thought maybe it was near Astoria. Is Fort Stevens near Astoria?
This.
Okay. And that was the time that your Uncle Bill and his wife had come from their home in Colorado to Oregon to visit family?
I believe that's true.
And your dad and Nancy Brophy and your grandparents and then your aunt and uncle were staying in a house there in Fort Stevens?
Correct.
And you and your wife came up for one day to visit, but you didn't spend the night?
Correct.
And you testified that you did have a conversation with your Uncle Bill about the firearms that he owned. Is that true?
Yeah, we had a passing conversation.
Did you talk to your Uncle Bill about the firearms that you owned?
It's possible. I don't recall.
I'm going to shift gears just because I didn't write this question down, and if I don't ask it now, I'm going to forget it. Was there a time right after your dad died that you drove your dad's chickens to a farm or a ranch?
That is true. I believe it would have been 2 or 3 days following.
Okay. And you were taking the chickens to live with a different family?
Yeah, I'm not 100%. Nancy had set it up.
Okay. But you drove them.
Correct.
Did you ever see Nancy care for those chickens?
Not if she could help it.
Okay. This was something your dad did.
Correct.
And the chickens that your dad had actually became kind of a joke between Nancy Brophy and your dad.
I don't know.
Did she buy him a chicken suit?
I believe so.
In fact, it's a chicken suit that you borrowed from time to time, is that right?
I don't know where it came from, but yes, I have borrowed a chicken suit from my father.
After your father died, a couple of weeks after your father died, did Ms. Brophy get some news regarding another death in her family?
Yes, I believe it was her brother.
And after her brother died, did Nancy Brophy need to go to Texas?
I believe that's correct.
And do you know why?
As I recall, she was the executor to his estate.
And so this had happened just a couple of weeks after your dad died.
Yeah, I don't recall exactly how long, but that sounds right.
You testified that you got this news about your father's death while you were at the beach.
That's correct.
And you don't remember whether Miss Nancy Brophy called you after your grandmother or whether you called her.
Yeah, I'm not 100% who initiated the call where we finally ended up touching base.
Was there a time that you had a conversation with Nancy Brophy and your grandmother was a part of that conversation as well on the phone?
Like a three-way phone call?
Yeah, or maybe just 3 people participating. Do you remember?
And I'm not 100% on the timing. After Kate and I, sorry, am I too close to this microphone? After Kate and I had an opportunity to kind of absorb the information and we're trying to figure out what our next move was, we were trying to decide if it was appropriate for us to leave and go home to support the family. And I'm not 100% who all was involved in that phone call, but I remember speaking with Nancy and her saying that there was nothing that could be done that night. Just come back in the morning and we would start figuring it out.
Okay, and is that what you did? You spent the night and then came back the next day?
That's correct.
And you'd gone to the coast the night before, is that right?
I believe so.
Do you remember what time you left for the coast?
I remember the last time I spoke to my father was on the 1st,
Uh-huh.
and I would say it actually was a call that came through on Nancy's phone. He was telling me he'd found a kitchen item at a rummage sale. So we probably didn't leave until mid-afternoon. I know that we stopped at the Tillamook Fred Meyer to get some groceries and red box film on our way to Rockaway. So I suspect that would have been in the 2 to 4 o'clock range.
You testified that you weren't aware of any money problems that the Brophies were having before your dad died.
Yeah, I was not intimately involved with their finances.
Your dad wasn't the kind of guy who would have talked to you about money, was he?
No.
In fact, your dad was pretty reserved. There are a lot of personal things that he wouldn't necessarily have discussed with you.
I wouldn't say that's necessarily true, but
Well, you talked about some things and maybe not others.
sure.
Did there come a time that you became aware that someone had come over to pack some pods
Uh,
at Nancy Brophy's house?
I'm not sure what the timeline would have been there.
Do you recall testifying before the grand jury that you became aware that she had hired some movers to come out and help her pack up?
That sounds reasonable.
Okay. You knew that over that summer, she both hired professional people to help her pack. Is it also true that family and friends came over and helped her clean up the house and pack?
Yeah, in fact, that second week I took off. I spent in the basement trying to help organize and figure out what was salvageable for resale or donation
And you weren't the only person who was there that day to help out with that, were you?
that week.
That week?
Yeah, there were several people.
And how many people do you think were there?
I know her niece Sarah was there, and forgive me, I'm not 100% on the familial relation, but Susan was there, whether that's a cousin or, and those are the two individuals I recall specifically. I know my wife Kate came out for at least a day, or maybe she just joined us for lunch. I'm not sure.
Okay. Were you there some days when writer friends came over and helped clean out parts of the house?
It's possible. If they weren't in the basement, I didn't see them probably.
Right. But you're aware that a number of different people came to help pack up that house to help out Nancy Brophy.
Yeah, a remarkable amount of work occurred in a short amount of time.
And did you know whether Nancy Brophy was on the mortgage to that house?
I think I learned that she was not on the mortgage to that house.
And did you learn that before she was arrested or after?
It would have been after, as I was trying to sort out what to do.
Based on what you knew about your dad's income and Nancy Brophy's income, do you think that either one of them could have continued to pay the mortgage if the other one was not contributing?
I honestly can't answer that.
Before Nancy Brophy was arrested, were you of the opinion that Nancy Brophy and your father had a great marriage?
Yeah, there was never much cause for concern. I could probably count on one hand the evenings we came over and noticed tension.
Were you of the opinion that because they had different interests but were still supportive and complementary of each other, that they had a strong partnership?
I I don't know how to respond to that. I think that to answer maybe in a different way, I think that one of the reasons the marriage was successful or seemingly successful was because they both were allowed as much time as they wanted to be individuals, and they did things separately.
They did things separately, but they also did many, many things together.
I mean, they would go on a trip together, sure, but I mean, on the week to week, they tended to, I mean, they would meet in the evening, but my father would go mushroom hunting for a weekend, and she would go to a writers group. Like they functioned very independently.
But as the day came to a close, your father invariably was home,
Sure.
and the two of them always had dinner together. It would be rare for them not to.
I think that's fair.
Your father would make her lunch every day.
I don't know that for sure.
You testified that Nancy Brophy provided care for your daughter Addie.
That's correct. If we could refrain from using my children's name, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Should we
Or
call?
her likeness, for that matter, would also be appreciated.
I was only going to ask a question.
I know. I'm just
Okay,
Sorry.
I want to be protective too, so I'm sorry. Your oldest daughter, would that be a better way for us to have a conversation?
Thank you.
You knew that Nancy Brophy was incredibly fond of your oldest daughter.
I do.
She doted on her,
Excessively.
and she actually even bought an insurance policy to help pay for her college.
I didn't learn that until after my father's murder, but I didn't know what the purpose of it was.
Was there a period right after your dad died that there was concern about finding a lost will?
I remember hearing something about it, but then I also believe I learned of resolution that had occurred.
And do you know how quickly that happened?
I don't.
And do you know how it was located?
I believe it was located by my grandfather,
Were you there when that happened?
not to my knowledge.
Were there times that you were trying to reach your father by the telephone and maybe he didn't answer his phone?
Sure.
And sometimes would you call Nancy Brophy and ask her if she would reach out to your dad or maybe go to OCI to see what was going on with him?
Are you talking about a specific instance or?
No, I'm talking about whether that might have happened generally.
Yeah, if it was something that I needed to speak with my father about, I would leave a message and know that he would respond. If it's something that I needed to reach one of them immediately, if he didn't answer, I would call Nancy.
And Nancy was willing to go down to OCI and locate him for you so that the two of you could connect.
I'm not sure that that specific instance ever occurred, but I knew that I could reach out to Nancy and at least get a message to him if I needed to.
Let me just make sure that I don't have any. I think the consensus is that I've asked enough questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Stillwater, there's several questions, some repeated to you, asking you about your opinion of your father's and Nancy's relationship. I think it's clear from your testimony, and probably others, that your father made a lot of food and Nancy ate a lot of food. But not a lot of discussion about any fighting, at least in front of people.
Correct.
My question to you is, if they did fight, like I think common sense would tell us, and like it's normal in a lot of marriages, it just didn't show? You didn't see it?
Yeah, I would not see any visible signs of arguing.
Did
I
you
mean,
ever?
aside from like an offhanded comment or, there was no like yelling or screaming.
There weren't screamers or yellers or
Right.
anything like that? At least not in front of anybody?
Correct.
Okay. Did you ever see any instances where Nancy would take a hard position on something and your father would just say, okay, and just go along with it, sort of acquiescing to her desires?
I can't think of a specific instance, but that seems like a tactic he might employ.
In your opinion, would your father sort of sometimes pick and choose his battles?
I think as we all do.
You talked about this when you were building the rifle that's been talked about a couple of times. That one of the things that you did was you did some research. And one of the things about research was asking people in the community.
Correct.
When you say in the community, you mean in the community of people who are familiar with firearms and possibly even piece together firearms?
Correct.
And did you also do some online research as part of that?
I tend to not put a lot of weight in online
Sure.
reviews.
You don't want to learn how to build a gun on Wikipedia?
Ever since I learned how the Amazon rating system functions, I really am shy of that.
Okay, that's fair. So what did this involve? Books, magazines, speaking with people in the
Sure,
community,
books,
stuff like that?
magazines, there's several shooting ranges that I, frequent less now. I don't really have the time, but for a while there was going to, and yeah, just trying to learn knowledge from folks that had more experience than myself.
So by the time you were able to piece together, or gather these parts together in order to build a gun, did you have pretty good knowledge base on how to actually do it?
Yes,
Okay, so is it safe to say that you learned everything you needed to know to build the gun without actually having to build it?
that's accurate.
Talked about a firearm part that you bought online and you referenced it as an optic, and then the questioning stopped on that line. What is an optic?
It's a magnified rifle scope.
Okay, so it has no bearing on the actual firing of the firearm, it's not responsible for any function of the firearm to make the gun fire.
It is not necessary for the gun to function.
Simply something for you to look through to help you in shooting.
Correct.
That's the only piece that you bought online?
That is correct.
Or at least to the best of your recollection at this
Yeah.
point. In fact, some of those parts that you had to buy, they actually did require a background check. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So you had to go into a gun broker and go through that background check in order to get a very critical piece of that firearm.
Correct.
You said that you thought that you mentioned this build to a friend, I think you said a nurse friend of yours, and that you maybe mentioned it to your father. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not 100% on. I know that my father didn't really have much of an interest in firearms, so it's very possible it came up, but
If Nancy knew that you had a build kit, or thought at least that you had one of these build kits, would that have come from you telling Nancy that, or would it have maybe come third person through your father?
I don't recall.
Okay.
I don't recall having that conversation with her specifically. However, I'm also not saying it didn't. I just don't remember.
Miss Maxfield asked you if you're the person that drove the chickens, your father's chickens, out to a ranch to rehome them. And you said that Nancy had set that up.
Correct.
So what, did you have any part in the planning or anything like that of having these chickens moved from your father's home to the ranch?
I mean, short of just logistics in terms of how to load these birds into my truck, no. I was just given a destination and she accompanied me.
Miss Maxfield asked you if there was an ongoing joke about the feelings between Nancy and Dan towards the chickens, but how did you think Nancy really felt towards the chickens?
I mean, I don't think she loved them,
And they were gone within 3 days of your father's death?
at least.
Now, Miss Maxfield asked you about Nancy's brother who passed away. Was that Texas, do you know?
I believe so.
And you were informed that Nancy was the executor?
Correct.
And are you aware are you aware of what most of Nancy's siblings, if not all of them, including parents, did for work?
I believe they're in the legal practice.
All of them lawyers? Did Nancy ever explain to you why the only non-lawyer of the family was assigned to be the executor of her brother's estate?
No.
Okay. Did she disclose to you that she had a financial interest in her brother's estate?
Your Honor, object, because I think that there's no evidence of that. And certainly,
What was the question?
I asked if she disclosed that she had a financial interest in her brother's estate, whether or not she did.
Yeah, I'll sustain the objection.
Nonetheless, she traveled to Texas. Did you know that?
At least once.
Okay. And that was just a couple of weeks after your dad had died?
That's correct.
So your father dies on June 2nd. Within a couple of weeks, she's off to Texas to be the executor?
Yes.
I don't know if this was I'm not sure what answer this was in response to the question, but did you tell Miss Maxfield that the last time you spoke with your father was on June 1st, 2018,
I believe that's correct.
in the afternoon sometime?
Yes. Early, I mean, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Sure. You mentioned this a little bit on direct, but that your dad would call you and ask you for help if he needed it. Is that correct?
Correct.
And he did that quite a bit?
Yeah, periodically.
If your dad had been aware of any financial problems that him and Nancy were having, and he brought that up to you, would you have helped him?
Of course, if we could.
Miss Maxfield asked you if you were aware whether or not Miss Brophy was on the mortgage of the home, and it sounds like you learned later that she was not. But were you aware whether or not she was actually on the deed?
I think I did learn that she had been added to the deed.
Did you learn that she had recently been added to the deed before the murder?
Yes.
You stated
Okay.
on,
Also, another recent fact, I hadn't realized they hadn't been married until recently. I assumed that that had taken place, 20 plus years ago.
okay, you were under the impression that they had been married 20-something years ago.
Correct.
But they recently had fixed some paperwork to make it actual legal marriage.
That was news to me.
And you said that if you couldn't get a hold of your dad, you could call Nancy.
Correct.
Was that because she was reliable and responsive to your phone calls?
She always had a phone or computer in her hand.
Did you ever have a problem getting a hold of Nancy?
Only the morning of his murder.
I have no further questions.
All right, Mr. Stillwater, you can step down. And we'll be in recess until Monday. Just as a reminder, I know I've said it multiple times, but just a weekly reminder to the jury not to discuss the case with anyone, including each other or family, until the very end of the case when you're in deliberations, and also to continue not to seek out information about the case from sources outside of the courtroom here. With that, we'll be in recess.
Okay, we'll go off record and I'll disconnect the order. All rise.